Alrighty, let's get started. Thank you again for joining today's really fascinating webinar that's near and dear to a lot of our hearts on prenatal nutrition and dairy's building blocks for baby's brain development. Research shows that the science is clear. The first 1,000 days between a woman's pregnancy and a child's second birthday is a small but important window of opportunity to nourish early brain development. We're here today to share insights on the first 1,000 days and why that period is so critical to brain development, a deep dive on the importance of iodine in this field, and then we'll close with the practical applications for us healthcare providers. And I am so delighted to share that we have three outstanding experts in this field presenting today. First, we have pediatrician, Dr. Liz Zamuda. She's the Director of Medical Education at Ohio Health Doctors Hospital and has been caring for children for over 20 years. As a mother of 4 children, she loves her job and believes that her kids make her a better pediatrician, and her experiences and knowledge gained from her work make her a better mom. Next, we have Dr. Elizabeth Pierce. Dr. Pierce is a renowned clinical investigator, endocrinologist, and epidemiologist who has made significant contributions to the field of iodine nutrition and thyroid disease in pregnancy. Her research has changed US recommendations for iodine supplementation and iodine use during pregnancy. She has served as president of the American Thyroid Association and currently serves as the North American Regional Coordinator for the Iodine Global Network. Last but not least, we have Marina Chaparro. Marina is a nationally recognized bilingual nutrition and diabetes expert specializing in pediatric and family nutrition. She's the founder of NutriChicos, a bilingual pediatric and family nutrition practice based in Miami, Florida. As a former spokesperson for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, Marina has extensive experience consulting with an industry, working with the media, and translating science into practical advice for everyday people. Here are our disclosures for today's webinar. All right, Dr. Liz, over to you. Let's get started.
Great, thanks, Megan. So we'll start right in. The first 1,000 days of life includes that time between pregnancy and a child's second birthday, and it offers a critical opportunity that has a huge impact on lifelong health. It's a period of remarkable brain growth, and it also represents a time of great potential and great risk. There's a lot of factors at play, but we know that good nutrition during pregnancy and early childhood plays a foundational role in allowing that child to grow, learn, and thrive. So we'll start off with a quick poll to gauge your knowledge of brain development. The poll did not show for me, but by the 4th week of pregnancy, baby's brain has an estimated 10,000 cells. So the question was, how many cells does it contain by the 24th week of pregnancy, or 6 months? And it looks like most people got it right. It's pretty astounding. By 24 weeks of pregnancy, the baby's brain already contains 10 billion cells. And during the first 1,000 days, we know the brain is growing more quickly than at any other time in a person's life. In fact, the neural tube is already developed 16 days after conception. And by just the 7th prenatal month, the baby's brain already represents that of an adult. So today I want to cover a little bit about the first 1,000 days. Then we'll talk about the role of nutrition in brain development. And then finally, some guidelines and recommendations that we can remember. Again, it's that 1,000 days between a woman's pregnancy and her child's second birthday that offers that brief but critical window of opportunity, and it has a tremendous impact on the child's development. And it's represented well in this graph here. So let's break it down a little bit so we can understand. If you look at the orange box, you can see that this is that time between preconception and the child's second birthday. So that critical opportunity that we're talking about. And to the left of the box where those green blocks are, you can see that first process of neurulation starts within the first 30 days, and it's followed by cell migration and differentiation. But the part I really want to point out are these lines to the right of the box, this period of rapid growth and development that's happening before the age of 2. And this tremendous growth, these peak growth periods also indicate times where there's high nutritional demand And the availability of that quality nutrition has a bigger impact on both the mom and that developing baby. We also know that a child's brain is making more than 1 million neural connections per second. And so it's really important that we take advantage of this critical opportunity for growth. So I want to point out just a couple of the things that are going on here. So the first line, the green line, that represents the sensory motor part of the brain. And that's how the baby's views the world in relation to their body. So it starts off by, common reflexes that we know, and then it evolves into things like cause and effect. So maybe shaking a rattle to hear a noise, or looking for an object under a blanket. The next line is the orange line there, and that represents memory, or the development of memory. And memory is stored in the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is an extension of the temporal lobe, which is also part of the limbic system. And that's the area that's responsible for emotions and impulsivity. And we know that part's developed by the age of 2 because of those terrible twos that we know of. And if you look at those two lines, they peak early and then they level off around the age of 2. And it doesn't mean that it stops developing, but again, it's that rapid growth that we can take advantage of earlier in life. And then finally, the third line is the red line, and that line represents the development of executive functioning, so that cognitive part of our brain. And that part lies in the frontal lobe or the prefrontal cortex. And you can see that it increases at a slower rate, and then it extends way out into the late teens or early 20s. And we know that process is going on and evolving throughout life. The other part I want to point out is that neural development actually involves increasingly complex neural circuits that rely on the successful completion of the earlier stages. And so again, it's really taking advantage of these critical time points in the child's life for their brain development. And we know the environment surrounding brain development is so important, but there's these biologic processes that are involved as well. So we also know there's critical periods of organ development in utero that determine viability for things like the heart and the lungs. But other things like the brain, the liver, or the immune system, they remain flexible throughout life. And it's those first 1,000 days, again, that represent a sensitive period where experiences that are affecting brain development can have a huge impact. But this developmental plasticity strongly shapes those neural circuits, and the adaptability can support both versatility and vulnerability. The second process called biologic embedding is so interesting to me because it reminds us that everything is starting right at conception. The embryo with this high degree of plasticity is actually responding to the environmental cues by doing things like modulating its metabolism, its gene expression, even its rate of cell division. It generates a developmental trajectory that's adapted to suit its anticipated environment. And so in a sense, it's planning ahead. The third process, epigenetics, is the interplay between genes and the environment. And it's now a well-recognized area that affects long-term health outcomes. But not only are the epigenetic changes inherited, but children are most sensitive to these changes during this period of rapid brain growth again. So think about a mom that's affected by food insecurity and malnourishment. In a nutritionally deficient environment, not only will the embryo inherit these effects, but it's also going to begin to plan ahead for the anticipated lack of nutrition if the mom's not well nourished. So just think about what that could set a child up for. And then finally, we know now that infants are born with billions of neurons and few synaptic connections, But during the first 1,000 days, it's this rapid surge that builds that foundation for brain development. And through synaptic pruning, the connections that are used frequently become stronger, and those that aren't used are pruned away. But the brain is intimately connected with every body system. So think about how your heart races if you have a startle response, or you might feel nauseous if you have an overwhelming emotion of some kind. It also extends into the somatic system. So think about someone having a heart attack with left arm pain, or a gallbladder attack and right shoulder pain. It's all connected. So the brain doesn't develop in isolation. It shapes and is shaped by both its external and its internal environment. And so if brain development is affected, every single body system can be affected, including everything from the muscles and bones to the GI system to the immune system. So as you can see, there's several key components in brain development that affect lifelong health. And if you look at those, responsive caregivers, safe and nurturing environments, and appropriate nutrition. And we have variable control over two of these. But today we'll take a closer look at nutrition in the first 1,000 days, which is an area that we can support through education and resources. So we've talked about now, good nutrition during pregnancy plays a foundational role in enabling that child to grow, learn, and thrive. And it provides the building blocks for the cognitive abilities, motor skills, and social emotional development in every child. And it has an impact on future success, including school and other economic impacts later in life. During those first 1,000 days, the child needs the right nutrients at the right time to feed the brain's rapid development. And poor nutrition can have long-term consequences for the child, the family, the community, even future offspring. We also know that conditions like obesity, hypertension, and diabetes can be programmed by nutritional status during this time period. In their policy statement on advocacy for improving nutrition to support childhood development and adult health, the AAP's Committee on Nutrition noted that there's 14 nutrients that affect early brain development. And when one or more of these is absent, a baby could be at risk for developmental delays or cognitive deficits. And because a person's diet and nutrient stores are the only source of nutrition for that developing baby, it's critical that mom gets the health care and nutrition that she needs to support that child. And I don't want to go into great detail, but I do want to point out what some of these nutrients functions are as we think about brain development. So when we talk about iron, it's responsible for the myelination of nerve fibers, which ultimately affects the brain's processing speed. Protein is something we know is a component of all cells in the body, things like muscle tissue, organs, neurotransmitters in the brain, and it's critical for brain development. Again, it also regulates metabolism. Copper plays a role in proper growth and development of bones, the brain, the heart, and other body organs, and it works with iron to form red blood cells. It also stimulates the immune system to promote healing. Folate, we know well, it has a role in early development of the brain and spinal cord. Zinc plays a role in the development of the autonomic nervous system, the hippocampus, and the cerebellum. Fats help develop the brain and the eyes. And then a new area of interest, iodine, supplies the needs for thyroid hormones, which supports healthy brain development. So again, all nutrients play a role, but there's 14 nutrients that are particularly vulnerable to deficiency due to the increased requirements of the developing brain. And I want to point out that our superfood, dairy, actually provides 50% of those nutrients for early cognitive development. And for all of the reasons we just talked about, screening for food insecurity is essential during these critical time periods of nutrition demand. So we know that food insecurity not only affects the nutritional status of mom and the baby, but it can also create a stressful environment. And food insecure infants and toddlers are more likely to have developmental delays, a lower IQ, and we know that the burden is the biggest on low-income families and people of color, which then further contributes to health and economic disparities. So let's talk about some guidelines and recommendations. The dietary guidelines for Americans provide advice on what to eat and drink to meet nutrient needs, promote health, and prevent disease. And they're updated every 5 years. And for the first time, this important role of prenatal nutrition and the impact on the developing baby was called out in those guidelines. For the first time, they took a life stage approach and included the recommendations for pregnant and lactating women, infants, and toddlers. There was a clear focus on responsive feeding and developmental readiness. The recommendations also provide the foundation for feeding that promotes physical and emotional wellness. And there's a lot in those guidelines, but I want to talk about just a few of the things that are specific to the prenatal period. So healthy weight gain, specific nutrients, and then finally dietary considerations. And I think it's important to point out that healthy weight gain in pregnancy is complex and it looks different for everyone. And so really what we want to do is focus on the nutrition, the overall quality of the diet for the mom, and things like specific nutrients that she needs, like folate, iodine, iron, and choline. And then some of the specifics that were discussed were things like including seafood in the diet once a week, avoiding alcoholic beverages, of course, moderating caffeine, and then finally, including dairy and eggs to provide that iodine and choline for cognitive development. We know now that adequate iodine intake during pregnancy is important for that brain development to the fetus. So today, I'm happy to share the screen and turn it over to the amazing Dr. Elizabeth Pierce, who has devoted her entire career to this topic.
It's a pleasure to be here today, and I want to talk a little bit about the importance specifically of iodine for maternal health and for baby's brain development. So I want to start by having you just think to yourself, in treating women of childbearing age, do you typically think about iodine nutrition, and do you discuss that with your patients? And if the answer is no, you are not actually alone. This is probably something that's not well recognized in the general public or among medical providers. We did a survey just a few years ago of US obstetricians and midwives and found that actually 3 out of 4 were either providing no dietary information about iodine or providing information that recommended an inadequate amount of intake. And of course, the importance of iodine for prenatal nutrition, as you've just heard, is really underscored by its new addition as a food component of public health concern for pregnant women in the recent dietary guidelines for Americans. So just to take you back 100 years, 100 years ago, you would all have known about the effects of iodine deficiency because in the US, it was a really visible public health problem. We had this region of the country, most of the upper portion of the US, in fact, with an epicenter around the Great Lakes, that was known as the goiter belt, because up to 70% of school-aged children in this part of the world had enlarged thyroid glands big enough to be seen or felt as a result of inadequate iodine nutrition. Starting in 1924, almost 100 years ago, we started to iodize salt in this country as an intentional way to prevent iodine deficiency. And this is an advertisement from Morton Salt in the 1920s saying that American mothers are bearing better babies since the introduction of this salt. And that was probably true. We have more recent economic analyses that suggest that there might have been as much as a 15-point average IQ increase in the portions of the United States that were most iodine deficient from before to after salt iodization. Now, more recently, we've looked at dietary iodine status in the US at a national level in the NHANES surveys. In the early 1970s, we had urinary iodine concentrations in the US that suggested that dietary iodine intake was adequate, in fact, perhaps even higher than it needed to be. And nobody worried about this for another 20 years. But in the time of the third NHANES survey in the early 1990s, we saw that there had been unexpectedly about a 50% reduction in iodine intakes in the United States, which was enormously unexpected and also really concerning. Somewhat reassuringly, since that time, national data suggests that our iodine nutrition has stabilized and it's remained overall in the optimal range. Why we had that huge drop in our iodine intakes is not entirely clear. This was probably multifactorial. May have been in part due to the fact that a number of commercial bakers which had been using iodine as a dough conditioner started phasing that out of their products. May have had something to do with changes in the dairy industry, or especially probably decreased dairy intake, because dairy is a pretty good natural source of iodine. And we know that currently only 2% of the US population is actually meeting recommendations for dairy intake. Starting in the 1970s, of course, there started to be much more understanding of the adverse effects of salt intake on cardiovascular health. And so there may have been a decrease in salt intake overall, which was probably a positive for public health, but also an erosion of the use of iodized salt specifically, which has had probably negative consequences. And we know that currently only half of the table salt sold for consumption in the United States is actually iodized. And most of those boutique salts that might be on your kitchen shelves, the Himalayan pink salt and the kosher salt, those are typically not iodized. In addition, seafood is an important source of iodine, but it's not something that a lot of Americans eat in large quantities. So with that as backdrop, why does this matter? And we need iodine to make thyroid hormone. As far as we know, that's actually the only thing it does in the body. But thyroid hormone is actually quite important. It regulates metabolism, and as already noted, it's critically important for brain development in pregnancy and in infancy. When we ingest iodine, it's pretty readily absorbed across the GI tract, kind of circulate in the plasma pool, and will either basically be taken up by the thyroid to make thyroid hormone, or it's excreted by the kidneys. Now, in pregnancy, women need more iodine than the rest of us. And that's true for a few reasons. One is that normal pregnancy causes shifts in hormones that typically result in about a 50% increase in thyroid hormone production. And so pregnant women need more iodine in the diet to support that increased thyroid hormone synthesis. In addition, the fetus has its own thyroid, which is starting to function about the middle of gestation. And in that second half of pregnancy, the fetus needs iodine to support its own thyroid hormone production. And that iodine does readily cross the placenta from mother to baby. Finally, pregnant women excrete more iodine in the urine than they do outside the pregnancy setting, probably as much as 30 to 50% more. Now, women who breastfeed will continue to have increased iodine needs after delivery, largely because iodine is actively concentrated in breast milk. It's present there at levels that are 20 to 50 times higher than its levels in plasma, and that seems to be nature's way of effectively making sure that the breastfed infant is getting adequate iodine nutrition. So how much do we need to support all of this? If you're a non-pregnant, non-lactating adult, you need about 150 micrograms of iodine a day to support thyroid hormone production. But if you're pregnant, that's more, about 220 micrograms a day. In lactation, still higher, about 290 micrograms a day. Children need less than adults by and large, and for infants under 12 months of age, it's not that the required intakes are higher, it's that we have less data to support the creation of a threshold, and so we use more conservative recommendations. In populations, we can assess iodine status looking at median urinary iodine concentrations. And the World Health Organization has given us these thresholds that we can look at. In populations with really optimal iodine nutrition, the median urinary iodine concentration will typically be somewhere in the range of about 100 to 300 micrograms per liter. Anything more than 300, as was the case in the US in the early 1970s, is considered potentially excessive. And then anything less than 100 micrograms per liter is consistent with iodine deficiency. Now, in pregnancy, where the requirements are higher and urinary excretion is also higher, the metrics are a little bit different. And a population of pregnant women with optimal iodine nutrition will have a median urinary iodine concentration about 150 to 249 micrograms per liter. Now, in lactation, the WHO has given us a threshold for urinary iodine concentration, but it's not clear how useful that is really, because most of the iodine is being excreted in breast milk, not in urine, and probably need to look at both the breast milk and the iodine to understand iodine status. That's breast milk and the urine to understand iodine status. Now, importantly, we can do that to understand iodine status at the population level. We cannot use urinary iodine to understand the iodine status of individual patients. And that's because for all of us, urinary iodine levels shift up and down, day to day, hour to hour. They really just reflect what we've eaten in the last few hours. And so it's been estimated that we need 10 to 12 spot or preferentially 24-hour urine samples to understand an individual's chronic iodine intakes with even 20% precision. And obviously this is not practical in the clinical setting. So we do not right now have an individual biomarker for iodine status, and therefore we rely on information about what people are getting in their diet, and information also about what we know about the population that they live in, part of the world. So specifically in pregnant women, we have an ongoing public health problem in many parts of the globe. You can see this as the most recent map for iodine status specifically in pregnancy. All of these countries in purple are considered to be iodine deficient in pregnancy. That includes, you'll see the US. It includes quite a large part of the globe. Also note that there are large parts of the globe in white here where we have no data. And also note that this is not a problem of developed versus developing countries. We see iodine deficiency in pregnancy in quite a large proportion of the developed world, including, as I said, the US and Australia and much of Western Europe. Now, in the US specifically, we saw the same big decline in iodine intakes between the early 1970s and the early 1990s that we saw in the general population. But what we've seen in pregnant women that's a little bit different from the general population is that, in fact, because pregnant women need more iodine than the rest of us, they are not achieving adequate intakes anymore. And in the last 10 years, we've seen a reemergence of mild iodine deficiency, specifically in pregnant women in our country. So this matters. And this matters because we think iodine deficiency is the leading preventable cause of intellectual disability globally. Now, the effects of iodine deficiency are different across the life stage. They depend on the severity of the iodine deficiency, and they depend also on life stage. At any age, inadequate iodine can lead to hypothyroidism or to goiter, thyroid enlargement. In pregnancy, severe iodine deficiency is associated with really adverse effects on the pregnancy itself, higher rates of miscarriage and stillbirth and infant mortality. But from a public health perspective, the major concern really is the effect of iodine on brain development and the concern that inadequate iodine intakes in early life can lead to impaired both physical and mental development. So iodine status affects cognitive development as early as the first trimester. In fact, that first trimester is probably a critically important time window, but this continues, as you heard, kind of up through the first 1,000 days of life. We know that in severely iodine deficient parts of the world, replacing iodine before women are pregnant will increase average population IQ based on a number of meta-analyses by anywhere between about 8 and 13 points, which has dramatic effects, not just on individual health outcomes, but on whole communities and whole economies. What we've really appreciated really only in the last decade is that it's not just severe iodine deficiency that can affect brain development, that we can see measurable effects of even mild iodine deficiency in a number of observational studies that have been published recently. A landmark study in the UK demonstrated that urinary iodine concentrations in pregnant women in the first trimester, even when they were just modestly low, signaling likely mild iodine deficiency, were associated with lower IQ and verbal and reading scores in children at the age of 8 to 9 years. Now, as for most nutrients, more is not always better. There's probably a U-shaped relationship between iodine intakes and health outcomes. That's demonstrated nicely by this very large cohort study with 33,000 mother-child pairs from Norway. And here you see a U-shaped relationship. So both maternal iodine intakes that are too low here in the second trimester of pregnancy, and also those that are too high were associated with increased risk for child communication and language delays at the age of 3. Now, how do we address all this? How do we prevent iodine deficiency in our pregnant patients? This is an important opportunity for all of us. So first, it's important to know that the American Thyroid Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics, among others, are recommending that certainly in the US and Europe, women who are pregnant, planning pregnancy, or who are breastfeeding should take a daily supplement that contains 150 micrograms of iodine. The problem is, although we started making those recommendations back in 2006, uptake has not been great. You can see on the left data from NHANES in 2011 to 2014, showing that women of reproductive age, pregnant women, lactating women, for all of those categories, fewer than 20% reported taking a daily iodine-containing supplement. And part of the problem with trying to get iodine supplementation into pregnant women is that not all of the prenatal vitamins sold in the US actually contain iodine. In fact, when we assessed this most recently, it's about 60%. And those multivitamin products that are sold as prescription products rather than over-the-counter are actually less likely to contain iodine than the over-the-counter ones. Diet can give you some hints as to whether our pregnant patients are getting enough iodine. Certainly women who ingest at least 3 servings of dairy a day, because that's a pretty good source of iodine nutrition, are unlikely to have low iodine intakes. Salt intake overall is not a good metric. And that's because the vast majority of salt that we all consume in America is not salt that we're adding at home in our kitchens or at the table. It's salt that's added to commercially processed foods. That salt is typically not iodized. And women who have restricted diets, for example, women who follow vegan diets, as we assessed in Boston a few years ago, probably because the lack of iodine in the diet, have low urinary iodines, therefore low iodine intakes, whereas the vegetarians who have dairy did not. So seafood, cow's milk, eggs, reasonably good sources of dairy. It is hard to find out where the iodine is in your diet, however, because it's typically not on package labels. And I would recommend the National Institute of Health's Office of Dietary Supplements website for a really good resource on where iodine is and what we're eating. So I would conclude by noting that iodine's role in prenatal nutrition is probably underappreciated by many patients and by many healthcare professionals. But it's important to know about this because pregnant women and their fetuses are really quite vulnerable to the effects of iodine deficiency. We have growing concerns about the recurrence of mild iodine deficiency in women during pregnancy and probably also in lactation in the US. And good sources of iodine nutrition to recommend to our patients include dairy foods, seafood, eggs, particularly the egg yolk has the iodine, iodized salt, and iodine-containing prenatal supplements. I close by noting that we think that adequate iodine nutrition really should be a right of every child. And with that, I would like to turn the podium over to our third speaker, Marina Chaparro.
Well, I'm going to start off by saying pregnancy is hard, right? We've heard some wonderful information and hopefully information that maybe was new to you. It was definitely information that was very novel and interesting to me, but we're now going to bring it back. We're now going to take it to real life. And I want you to think of, that pregnant neighbor, or I even want you to think back if you were pregnant or if your partner was pregnant, kind of what was that like? We're going to take it back from theory to practice. And so we're going to talk about, give me one sec. And so today's agenda, we're going to be talking about a few things. The first one is the expectation versus reality. So, kind of understanding the pain points of maybe our clients and our patients. Secondly, we're going to jump to kind of the nutrition trends and what I call the areas of not concern, but opportunity. And I think this is where we as providers can really have a big impact. And so we're going to understand really what the problem is and why it matters. And lastly, we're going to jump into what I call the 3 S's: superfoods, the snacks, and the support. And we're going to kind of put it all together. So as you know, I am a registered dietitian. I'm a diabetes educator, but I'm also a mom. I'm a mom of 2 beautiful girls. There, I was pregnant with Alicia, who's now 4. And I also live with type 1 diabetes. So definitely there's differences and a unique set of, issues that I had to deal with. But I can tell you that for me, it was very overwhelming. And, I'm a registered dietitian. I'm quote unquote an expert. And I was very overwhelmed with all the information that I received. And not surprisingly, our moms to be, and even just everybody in general, we get so bombarded with lots of information. And so with the pregnant women, we got to be careful with the seafood. Yes, have the seafood, but the mercury. Then we're talking about the weight gain and make sure you don't gain a lot of weight, gestational diabetes, and make sure you exercise, but the right kind, right? And, food safety, and are we cooking things right? We talked about the right supplement. I mean, how do we choose a supplement with so many things that we need to consider? And one of my favorites is the coffee or the caffeine, kind of these misconceptions that we have. And my sister, I remember when she was pregnant, she said, "Oh, Marina, I can no longer have, my favorite chocolate chip cookie." I said, "Why? What happened?" She said, "Well, the chocolate chip cookie has chocolate. Chocolate has caffeine. So I can't eat that chocolate chip cookie." And in my mind, I was just like, wow. I mean, a lot of the messages that our clients are receiving are not necessarily evidenced by science. And so I think, the expectation versus reality could be very different for everybody. And I think we as providers, of course, we're looking at, nutrients and the data, but sometimes the reality is very, very different. We might have nausea, we might be constipated, we might have heartburn. I had type 1 diabetes. And so it's unique to everybody. And so I was very interested in iodine, and I did a very scientific research, not at all. I just started to ask my audience, hey, when you were pregnant, did anybody tell you about iodine? When I was pregnant, that was not something that I heard of. And of course, most of my audience was like, huh? Iodine what? So not surprisingly, this is what a lot of our clients might not know. And so this is state of the plate, kind of looking into how are we eating? How are we following the recommendations across the lifespan? From 0 to 100 being we're following it all. And so we start off pretty well, ages 2 to 4 with a 61 index. And then really adult women, we're at a 56, 54. And, as Dr. Samuda said, we really want women who are planning to become pregnant to have optimal nutrition. So there's still a lot of opportunity. There's still a lot that we can do here. So let me tell you my story. So I have type 1 diabetes, right? I was very frightened to become pregnant. So I became pregnant. I had a wonderful team of endocrinologists, perinatologists, so on and so forth. And I met with a healthcare provider, not a registered dietitian, who said the following: "Marina, we really want you to avoid milk, yogurt, and most fruits because they have a lot of sugar." Of course, I did not tell them I was a registered dietitian or diabetes educator. And in my mind, I just kept thinking, wait, that is my main source of calcium. That is my main source of vitamin D. That is what I'm getting my fiber, not to mention my probiotics from the yogurts. So what's the moral of the story? I mean, I think that there's a lot of messages that our clients might hear. And of course, as an RD, I was focused on, specific nutrients, and I knew the science. But the reality is that I also wanted real practical nutrition. And we don't eat nutrients. We eat food, right? And so I think that pregnancy is a time of significant physical and, emotional changes. And I think this is where we as providers can give practical solutions because, I think just because we providers tell them these recommendations doesn't mean they're going to follow them, just like when they told me that. So how can we really make an impact to something that they are going to do, they are going to follow? So let's jump into nutrition trends and areas of concern or opportunity, as I like to call it. So what's the problem? Well, there's various problems, and we've already heard it before. So iodine needs go up by 50% during pregnancy and lactation. This is huge. We also know there's a trend in restrictive diets, whether, they're limiting seafood, they're limiting dairy, eggs, meat, so on and so forth. We also know that food insecurity is a huge issue. I mean, you look at today's headlines, inflation, stock markets. We also know that a lot of prenatal supplements might not contain iodine. And we'll talk a little bit more about these non-iodized salts, right? Kind of the halo effect. But in general, there's just a lack of awareness, as the Instagram poll said. So I'm going to talk about these 4 main areas of opportunity: nutrition, restrictive trends, non-iodized salts, plant-based milks, and food insecurity. So, there's definitely increase in restrictive diet trends, right? And we know that diets that restrict dairy, seafood, and eggs definitely put women at risk of iodine deficiency. And yes, I am a registered dietitian. I am all for fruits and veggies. However, most fruits and veggies are not a great source of iodine. And so I think my role as a registered dietitian is not necessarily to be a food police, not to tell them you're doing this wrong, but rather understand why are they doing what they're doing? Why do they eat what they eat? And then guide them and make sure they're getting the right support. They're getting the food that they need, their baby needs, their family needs. And let's be clear, the recommendation is not use table salt, right? Because we know preeclampsia is a big consideration, especially for among Black women, but rather the recommendation is let's choose iodine-rich food. And if you are using a table salt, hey, by the way, which salt are you using? Could we make sure it's iodized if you're pregnant or lactating? And can we make sure to get a supplement with iodine? And let's talk a little bit about plant-based beverages, right? You go to the supermarket, there's aisles dedicated. But we need to be clear that a lot of these plant-based beverages do not have the same nutrition profile. Some might not be fortified, some might have more added sugar. And as a pediatric registered dietitian, I'm focusing on kcals per kilogram. So I'm focusing on that additional energy from whole milk that we're having. And not to mention, we talked about how dairy provides 13, 14 of these brain powering nutrients. So again, if for some reason they're unable to drink whatever, dairy or consume it, how can we make it work for them? And let's talk a little bit about this. So just really quickly, we know that, cow's milk would have about 88 milligrams. The idea, the recommendation would be, if you can, it would be soy beverage. But as we can see here, soy beverage and almonds do not have a good source of iodine. They lack. So lactose intolerance, for some reason, if your clients are lactose intolerant, this does not mean they need to go dairy-free, right? Because there's multiple types of dairy, of lactose-free, milk, that filtered milk. Or we can also have some of the live active cultures from yogurt, right? And not to mention, gut health, immunity, that's such a huge, topic right now. And hard cheeses also contain very little lactose. And so, you go to your neighbor's pantry and you will see probably millions of salts, the Himalayan, the sea salt, so on and so forth. But maybe there's a halo effect they believe to be healthier, but the price is also different. And, talking about the price, food insecurity is another huge issue. Again, it affects 15% of our households with children. And the message is not, you need to buy these organic, expensive, food in order to be nutritious. No, you can get nutritious food that is, affordable, versatile, and it tastes good. And it's only 20 cents per serving. Dairy's nutrition is hard to beat. It has 13 essential nutrients, some of the brain supporting ones that we talked about. So it's easy to digest, especially if, pregnant women have nausea. So it's hard to beat. And so let's briefly talk about the 3 S's. The first one is the superfoods. And what I mean superfood, it's not superfood, but rather, how can I educate my clients on, there are some nutrients that I really want you to focus on, but let me make it easy for you. And let me actually give you examples of the foods. So this would be an example of something that I would give, say, the calcium, the iodine, the potassium, all of these, public health nutrients of interest that we have. And as you can see, there's common similarities, right? We see dairy in a lot of them. We have the eggs, we have the fish, we might have the nuts. And so how can we get the biggest bang for your buck? And so if there might, have some concerns, whether, the cholesterol or, what about pasteurization, or, what if I have lactose intolerant, or what about the mercury in fish? I think this is an opportunity to talk about these myths, to educate them and put them at ease. And so snacks, just in general, I love snacks, but I think for pregnant women, they do play a unique role, because this is a great way to optimize nutrition, right? We want to fill in the gaps and kind of the areas of concern. Not to mention, small frequent meals, third trimester, reflux, we're not going to be able to tolerate and eat a lot. And so if we can make them hearty, if we can include some of these good nutrients in food, the fat, fiber, and the protein. So I like to give them ideas, right? This is what it really looks like. And lastly, support. I mean, this is what, for me, this is what support means. It means giving my clients culturally relevant meal ideas that work for them. You know, every time that I meet with clients and families is like, just give me ideas. And even as a mom myself, I'm running out of ideas. So this would be an example of kind of on the go meal ideas. So we have a breakfast, you know, some overnight oats you can make the night before with a little bit of Greek yogurt with the calcium, the vitamin D, the iodine, a little chia seeds, nutrition booster on top. Snack, maybe a cheese stick, a high fiber granola bar you can take on your bag. And if we're packing maybe a lunch from yesterday, like leftover pasta with maybe some iodized salt, mozzarella sticks, we have some fruit, extra fiber. And, you know, for snacks, I'm always loving the little prepackaged containers. It's easy to carry. We have some nuts, we have some fruits. And lastly, at dinner, this is some pork carnitas that we did on the crock pot overnight, some tacos, a little bit of mozzarella cheese, and some rice and some beans. So culturally relevant, this is somebody that's on the go, right? So our job as providers is, let's screen our clients. You know, are you eating dairy? Are you, restricting certain nutrients or certain foods? I'm sorry. Do you consume iodized salt? Which supplement do you take? And give them, evidence-based recommendations, but that work for them. And so recap, right? Pregnancy is hard, right? Iodine needs increase by 50%, and women who don't regularly consume dairy foods, eggs, and seafood could be at risk. And there's a lot of areas of opportunity to dispel some of these nutrition myths, to counsel on restrictive diets, on plant-based meals, on the use of salt, and make it affordable. And I focus on the 3 S's, the superfoods, the snack, and the support. So make it easy, make it work for them. And again, we eat food, not nutrients.
Wow. Thank you, Marina, Dr. Pierce, and Dr. Zamuda. That was an excellent presentation. Gosh, we so appreciate the insightful perspectives each of you shared today. I know many of us will walk away with valuable learnings that can improve our everyday practice as health professionals. I think for me, the 3 biggest takeaways were, how those first 1,000 days are vital for brain development, and particularly the importance of nutrition for both mom and for baby. Next, the implications for iodine specifically. For many of us, perhaps it wasn't a nutrient that we really think of when it comes to prenatal health and cognitive development. As we learned, even mild to moderate deficiencies can have implications on baby's brain development and cognitive growth. And lastly, from Marina, the value of just keeping it simple, keeping it real, positive, and non-judgmental when it comes to providing guidance to pregnant and breastfeeding women, and then understanding how we can guide them through some of the common misconceptions. So thank you all so much again. In the essence of time, I do want to transition fairly quickly to ensure we can address some of the questions that we received throughout the presentation. So real quick, if you enjoyed this, we have a whole library of free resources on our website on similar fascinating topics, all offering CEUs, including an ethics credit. So be sure to check that out. All right. So thank you all for the really thoughtful questions. We received a lot, and we have the team behind the scenes going through them to do our very best to consolidate them and rank the most frequently asked questions. So let's get started. All right, so I'm going to address the first question. We did receive some comments about, where to find the iodine content in foods, and is there any source? And, as we know, iodine is not mandatory to be on the nutrition facts label on foods, and it's, not commonly found in processed foods. So if you want to find, a good database for iodine content, you're in luck. Just this past January, the USDA, FDA, and NIH together published a public database of iodine content in foods. I messaged our team to repost the link right about now. to where you can find this database, but you can also easily find it by just Googling, quote, USDA iodine database 2022, and it'll pop up. And what's nice is that it offers iodine content per food serving size by the rack, as well as per 100 gram values. That's a great place to start for your practice. Now, looking at the other ones. So this next question, I think, is for you, Marina. And after that, Dr. Liz, you can always comment on it as well from a pediatrician's perspective. But Marina, you talked about lactose intolerance and ways you can still consume dairy. But what if a mom and baby has a true dairy allergy and they really cannot consume dairy foods? Can you speak to some of the foods that still provide those brain supporting nutrients?
And, I think it's also important to know, like, really making sure we get the diagnosis right, because I think there's also, I am intolerant to dairy or I'm true allergic. And so whether, let's say, last week, I saw a baby with a true cow's milk protein allergy who was breastfeeding. And so I think in this case, we really want to guide the mom and maybe, limit some of these dairies, some of the dairy or all of it, because there's a true reason. We realize that a lot of these allergies, especially in kids, the milk allergies might be outgrown later on. So I would kind of want to discuss a little bit more, is it an intolerance? Is it a true allergy? How can we make sure? Because I don't want to restrict something that we don't need to. But if there is a true allergy, we would need to go to the eggs. We would need to go to the seafood. We would need to rely on some of the other sources that Dr. Pierce had spoken about, whether they're using kind of iodized salt. And if it's maybe an intolerance, right, we can still consume potentially a lot of the filtered milks that are still going to be the real deal. So they're going to have the same nutritional benefits. Or maybe the yogurt, the Greek yogurt, which can help digest. Remember that yogurt contains the lactose. So for a lot of the lactose intolerant, it could be something that they could totally have. So it depends. It really depends. But these, hopefully that helps answer the question, or maybe Dr. Sumu, that you would want to add.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And I think the only thing that I would add is that a lot of times my experience has been that there's a mom who's done fine with dairy throughout their life, and then they go to breastfeed their baby, and maybe the baby has some sensitivity that at least seems to be related to dairy. So for me, though, the most important thing is to really engage your pediatrician and a pediatric allergist to make sure that that's actually the case, because it is a huge issue if you have to exclude that or anything from the diet. So I think that's the first step that I like to focus on. And then the other thing, I think my primary job as a pediatrician is to often ease fears. And what I've noticed is that babies that sometimes have a sensitivity, not a true allergy, to some dairy products when they're being breastfed, they actually do outgrow that. And it's because their immune system is developing. And so that slow exposure over time allows them to ultimately do quite well with that. So I think it's really important to make sure that the parents have accurate information and the right people engaged, so that they don't function out of that place where they're just worried and then they just completely shut it out, because it is a huge opportunity for them to be able to utilize dairy as they're building that child's diet over the course of their lifetime. So that's the only other thing I would add.
Thank you both. It's so great to hear two different perspectives from a pediatrician and a dietitian. So thank you. All right, let's see. So this next question is for you, Dr. Pierce, our iodine expert. Can you speak about sea vegetables? So things like seaweed and how they contribute to iodine. I know it wasn't on our chart, but I think it's worth talking about.
So seaweed, by and large, contains a fair amount of iodine, but it's variable. So it depends on the species and the location where it's harvested and the time of year. And there can be a really big range of iodine content of seaweed. And remembering that we have concerns about excess as well as insufficient iodine intakes in pregnant and lactating women, I actually would not recommend seaweed as a source of iodine, specifically in pregnancy and lactation, because there's such a high risk of just overshooting the appropriate amounts.
definitely. And I'm thinking to those U-shaped curves that you had on your slide. That was so impressionable. Okay. So, this one might be for you, Dr. Liz, and maybe Dr. Pierce, you can comment on it. Is it recommended to increase intake levels of iodine if you have multiples, so like twins or triplets? Does that affect your daily value needs?
Actually, I'll jump in. Probably not. There's a slightly higher thyroid hormone production in women with multiple gestation, but the amount of iodine that's recommended to increase for a singleton pregnancy would easily cover what you need for twin or triplets.
Wonderful, thank you. Dr. Liz, you may have touched upon this when we were talking about allergies, but for lactation, there are many moms out there that are not drinking milk and avoiding it because it makes their baby upset, or they believe it contributes to colic, and so they completely cut out dairy. Can you speak to what advice we should provide them and what steps we should take as healthcare professionals?
Sure. I think the thing I like to do first is identify if that is actually the problem, because again, we come home with this baby and we don't know anything about them yet. And it takes so much time to learn it. And babies are fussy because they're responding to their environment and their GI systems are developing. And so new foods create all kinds of sensations for them that they aren't really sure of what's going on. And so I think sometimes this is that correlation and not causation. And so really trying to pick through the details and having discussions with parents about, is this really dairy, or is this just normal baby behavior that's frustrating and that we need to just acknowledge and accept? And I would say that most of the time it's the latter. If I have concerns that it could be directly caused by dairy, then that's when I would engage that allergist and really try to make sure we understand, what's the level of that sensitivity and is it something that's going to last over time?
Thank you. Thank you. And I know we have 2 minutes left, and there were a few comments about the variability of iodine in dairy products, and I can address that pretty quickly. If you do refer to that new iodine database, it does give you the sample size as well as the minimum value found in a glass of milk and the maximum value. And it varies quite a bit because it depends on the cow's diet, it depends on the geography and the iodine in the soil. It depends on the teat sanitation practices, which iodine has been used for years as a really effective and safe use of sanitation. But what you can see from the database, if you like to go into the numbers, is that it ranges from 31 to 208 micrograms per serving. So even the lowest content in milk still gives you an excellent source of your daily value of iodine. So just to address that question. That's about it. I don't want to go over time. I want to be mindful of everyone's times, but if I can just say one more time, thank you so much to Marina, Dr. Pierce, Dr. Liz. This was so fascinating, so interesting. And like I said before, I know a lot of us are going to walk away thinking, oh my gosh, iodine for prenatal health and nutrition. So I hope everyone's clapping at home because I want to clap right now. Thank you guys so much. Attendees, thank you so much for joining us at National Dairy Council, and be sure to keep an eye out for the post-webinar survey and our next webinar. So have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you.